The year was 1867, and the Texas frontier was a place where mercy came with a tomahawk and justice rode on horseback. Sarah Mitchell never imagined that her salvation would come from the very people her neighbors feared most. In a world where the color of your skin determined your fate and the sound of war drums meant death, sometimes the most unlikely hero emerges from the shadows of prejudice. This is the true story of how a Comanche war chief became the thin line between a widow's grave and her second chance at life, proving that humanity can bloom even in the darkest corners of the American frontier. The morning sun painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and rose, casting long shadows across the Mitchell homestead. Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching her husband Thomas guide their 2 horses toward the barn. The smell of fresh biscuits filled the small cabin, mixing with the earthy scent of coffee brewing over the fire. It was a peaceful morning, the kind that made frontier life seem almost civilized. Thomas had been up before dawn, as was his habit. At 32, he carried himself with the confident stride of a man who had carved his place in this unforgiving land through sweat and determination. His calloused hands spoke of years spent working cattle, building fences, and defending what was his. Sarah watched him pause to examine the fence line where they had heard coyotes the night before. She smiled, knowing he would spend the morning reinforcing every post and rail. The couple had been married for 8 years, having met when Sarah traveled west with her father to establish a trading post. Thomas had been one of the first customers needing supplies for his growing ranch. What started as business transactions gradually became longer conversations, shared meals, and eventually a wedding that brought together 2 families determined to thrive in Texas territory. Their homestead sat 15 miles northwest of San Antonio, far enough from town to provide the isolation Thomas preferred, but close enough to trade their cattle and buy supplies. The land stretched for nearly 200 acres, with good grass for livestock and a reliable creek that never ran dry, even during the harsh summer months. Thomas had chosen the location carefully, positioning their cabin on a slight hill that provided clear views in all directions. Sarah busied herself preparing breakfast, cutting thick slabs of bacon from the side they had cured last fall. The familiar routine brought comfort in a land where comfort was often scarce. She had learned to find joy in simple moments, in the satisfaction of bread rising properly, in the sight of healthy cattle grazing in their pastures, in the sound of Thomas humming as he worked. The isolation that Thomas valued sometimes weighed heavily on Sarah. Weeks could pass without seeing another woman, without hearing news from back east, without the simple pleasure of conversation with someone who understood the particular challenges of frontier life for women. When loneliness crept in, she reminded herself that they were building something lasting, something they could pass on to the children they hoped to have. As the bacon sizzled in the iron pan, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of multiple horses approaching. This was unusual, as visitors typically announced themselves with calls or whistles long before reaching the cabin. Thomas had taught her to be cautious about unexpected arrivals, as the frontier attracted all manner of people, not all of them friendly. She moved to the front window and counted 6 riders approaching at a steady pace. They were still too far away to make out faces, but something about their posture and the way they spread out as they approached made her stomach tighten with unease. She called out to Thomas, who was emerging from the barn with a hammer in his hand. The riders were local men, faces Sarah recognized from town, but names she could not always remember. Their leader was Jake Morrison, a man whose reputation for violence preceded him wherever he went. He owned a large spread south of San Antonio and had been vocal about his belief that the land belonged to white settlers, not to the Comanche, Apache, or Mexican families who had lived there for generations. Morrison had been drinking. Sarah could tell by the way he swayed in his saddle and the too loud quality of his voice when he finally spoke. The other men appeared sober but agitated, their faces grim with purpose. Each carried a rifle across his lap and several had ropes coiled and hanging from their saddle horns. "Mitchell!" Morrison called out as the group came to a stop 20 yards from the cabin. "We need to talk." Thomas approached slowly, the hammer still in his hand but held low at his side. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he moved that told her he sensed danger. "Morning, Morrison. What brings you out this early?" "Had some trouble last night," Morrison replied, his words slightly slurred. "Lost 6 head of cattle to raiders, found tracks leading this way." Sarah felt her breath catch. Cattle raids had been increasing in recent months as tensions between settlers and local tribes escalated. The Texas Rangers were spread thin, and many ranchers had taken to forming their own groups to pursue suspected raiders. These groups rarely distinguished between guilty and innocent when seeking justice. "I haven't seen any strangers on my land," Thomas replied evenly. But you're welcome to look around if you think the tracks lead here. Morrison's laugh was harsh and humorless. Oh, we've already looked around, Mitchell. Found some very interesting things in your barn. Sarah's confusion deepened. She had been in the barn just yesterday helping Thomas repair a broken harness. There had been nothing unusual there, nothing that could possibly be connected to cattle theft. She watched as two of Morrison's men dismounted and walked toward the barn, disappearing inside. The minutes that followed moved with dreamlike slowness. The men emerged from the barn carrying items Sarah had never seen before. A Comanche lance decorated with feathers and beadwork, a painted shield, and a leather bag that Morrison claimed contained fresh meat from stolen cattle. Sarah stared in bewilderment, knowing these items had not been there yesterday. Mighty interesting company you've been keeping, Mitchell, Morrison said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Trading with the enemy, are you? Maybe even helping them plan their raids? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Sarah could see Thomas struggling to process what was happening, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and growing fear. Those aren't mine, Morrison. Someone planted them there. Convenient story, another writer said. Real convenient. Sarah realized with growing horror that this had been planned. The planted evidence, the early morning arrival, the ropes carried by several of the men. This was not an investigation, but an execution waiting to happen. Morrison and his group had already decided Thomas was guilty, and they had come to dispense frontier justice. Now hold on, Thomas said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. If you think I'm involved in cattle theft, take me to town. Let the sheriff sort this out. Morrison's response was to spit into the dust at his horse's feet. Sheriff's 3 days' ride from here. Can't wait that long for justice. Besides, we know what we know. The other men began to dismount, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Sarah could see ropes being uncoiled, could see the cold determination in their faces. These were not men who had come to talk or investigate. They had come to kill, and the planted evidence was simply their justification. Thomas must have realized the same thing, because he suddenly raised the hammer in his hand. Stay back! I won't let you murder me for something I didn't do. The response was swift and brutal. 2 men rushed Thomas from different angles, overwhelming him before he could use the hammer effectively. Sarah screamed from the window as her husband disappeared beneath a pile of attackers. When they pulled back, Thomas was unconscious, blood flowing from a gash on his forehead. Morrison dismounted slowly, drawing a length of rope from his saddle. String him up, boys. That oak tree over there should do nicely. Sarah burst from the cabin, running toward the group of men who were dragging her husband toward a large oak tree that stood 50 yards from their home. Stop! Please! He's innocent! Those things aren't ours. One of the men caught her arms, holding her back as she struggled to reach Thomas. You'll get your turn, lady, he said, his breath reeking of whiskey. Morrison thinks you're in on this too. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They intended to kill them both. This was not justice or even misguided vengeance. This was murder, planned and executed by men who had convinced themselves they were protecting their community. Thomas regained consciousness as they looped the rope around his neck. His eyes found Sarah's face, and she could see him trying to speak, trying to offer some final comfort or reassurance. But the men jerked the rope tight, cutting off his words before they could form. Sarah watched in helpless horror as they threw the other end of the rope over a thick branch. Morrison mounted his horse and wrapped the rope around his saddle horn. Any last words, cattle thief? Thomas managed to gasp out 3 words. Protect my wife. Morrison spurred his horse forward. The rope went taut. Thomas Mitchell died 20 yards from the home he had built with his own hands, in sight of the woman he loved, executed by neighbors who had decided his guilt without trial or evidence. Sarah's screams echoed across the prairie as her husband's body swayed in the morning breeze. The men who had murdered him showed no remorse, no hesitation, no recognition that they had just destroyed 2 innocent lives. Morrison coiled his rope with the same casual efficiency he might use after a day working cattle. Now for the woman, Morrison announced, turning towards Sarah with the same cold determination he had shown her husband. Can't leave witnesses to tell lies about what happened here. Sarah found herself pushed toward the same tree where Thomas still hung. Through her tears and rage, she could see the men gathering more wood, could smell coal oil being poured. They intended to burn her alive, to make her death even more horrific than her husband's quick hanging. As they bound her hands and began to pile brush around the base of the tree, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to pray. She thought of Thomas, of the life they had planned together, of the children they would never have. She thought of her parents back in Missouri, who would never know what had become of their daughter. But as the flames began to lick at the dry brush, as Morrison lit the torch that would ignite her funeral pyre, Sarah heard something that made her open her eyes. In the distance, growing steadily louder, came the thunder of hoofbeats and the high, piercing war cries that meant only one thing: the Comanche were coming. The war cries grew louder, echoing across the prairie like thunder before a storm. Morrison's men scattered from the growing fire, grabbing for rifles and taking defensive positions behind whatever cover they could find. The torch fell from Morrison's hand, landing in the dry grass and sending up wisps of smoke that seemed insignificant compared to the approaching danger. Sarah remained bound to the tree, smoke beginning to sting her eyes as the flames spread through the kindling at her feet. The heat was becoming uncomfortable, but her attention was fixed on the cloud of dust rising from the horizon. She could make out individual riders now, at least 20 of them, riding hard toward the homestead with weapons raised. Morrison shouted orders to his men, his earlier confidence replaced by obvious fear. "Take cover, spread out. Don't let them surround us." But his voice carried a note of panic that suggested he knew his small group was badly outnumbered. The Comanche riders crested the hill like a wave breaking over a shore, their painted horses moving with fluid precision across the rough ground. Even in her terror, Sarah was struck by the sight of them. These were warriors in their element, moving with their mounts as if they were single creatures designed for speed and violence. The leader rode ahead of the others, his presence commanding attention even at a distance. He sat his horse with the natural grace of someone who had learned to ride before he could properly walk. His war paint was more elaborate than the others, geometric designs in red and black that covered half his face and extended down his neck and arms. But it was his eyes that Sarah noticed most as he drew closer. They were not the wild, bloodthirsty eyes she had been taught to expect from Comanche warriors. Instead, they held an intelligence and intensity that reminded her of Thomas when he was working through a difficult problem. This was not a mindless savage, as the stories claimed, but a leader making quick calculations about a complex situation. The war party split into two groups as they approached, one sweeping around to the left, while the other came straight toward the homestead. The maneuver was executed with military precision, cutting off any escape routes for Morrison's men while maintaining clear lines of attack. Morrison fired first, his shot going wild in his panic. The sound seemed to hang in the air for a moment before being answered by a volley from the approaching warriors. One of Morrison's men cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder where a Comanche arrow had found its mark. Sarah realized with growing amazement that none of the Comanche weapons were aimed at her. The warriors were targeting only the men who had murdered her husband, riding past her burning pyre to engage the real threat. She could feel the heat growing more intense at her feet, could smell her dress beginning to singe, but the immediate danger seemed to be from the fire rather than the attacking warriors. The battle was swift and decisive. Morrison's men were caught in the open, with nowhere to retreat and insufficient numbers to mount an effective defense. Two more fell to Comanche lances before Morrison himself raised his hands in surrender, his rifle thrown aside in the dust. The war chief who had led the charge rode directly towards Sarah, dismounting while his horse was still moving. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with the lean build of someone who lived a life of constant physical challenge. His face bore old scars from previous battles, but his movements were fluid and confident. Without hesitation, he began cutting the ropes that bound her to the tree, his knife slicing through the thick hemp with swift, efficient strokes. When her hands came free, Sarah stumbled away from the growing fire, her dress smoking but not yet aflame. The war chief caught her arm, steadying her as she struggled to maintain her balance. "You hurt?" he asked in heavily accented but clear English, his dark eyes scanning her for injuries. Sarah stared at him in shock. She had never heard a Comanche warrior speak English, had never imagined that this fearsome figure could show concern for a white woman's welfare. No, I don't think so. But my husband..." Her voice broke as she looked toward the oak tree where Thomas still hung. The war chief followed her gaze, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. He understood immediately what had happened here, could read the story in the placement of the rope, the planted evidence, the hasty execution. "These men kill your husband?" he asked, gesturing toward Morrison and his surviving companions, who were now surrounded by Comanche warriors. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "They said he was stealing cattle, but it wasn't true. They planted things in our barn, then came here and murdered him." The war chief's face hardened further. He walked over to where Morrison knelt in the dust, his hands still raised in surrender. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "You kill innocent man," he said, the words coming out like individual stones dropped into still water. "You burn innocent woman." Morrison tried to bluster, to maintain some semblance of the authority he had wielded just minutes earlier. "Now see here, Chief. This doesn't concern your people. We were dealing with cattle thieves, protecting our property." The war chief's response was to gesture toward the planted evidence that still lay scattered near the barn. He picked up the Comanche lance, examining it closely before speaking again. "This not Comanche lance. Wrong feathers, wrong paint. You make this to lie." Sarah watched in amazement as the war chief systematically exposed the deception. He pointed out details in the fake artifacts that proved they had been created by someone with only superficial knowledge of Comanche craftswork. The leather bag supposedly containing stolen beef actually held rabbit meat that had been cured in a way no Comanche would recognize. Morrison's face went pale as his carefully constructed frame began to crumble under the war chief's expert examination. The other surviving members of his group exchanged nervous glances, realizing that their leader's plan had been transparent to someone who actually knew Comanche culture. "You want us believe your people take cattle," the war chief continued, his English becoming more precise as his anger grew. "But you make bad copies of our things. You think we stupid, not see your lies." One of Morrison's men tried to run. He made it perhaps 20 yards before a Comanche lance brought him down. The war chief watched without emotion, then turned back to Morrison with the expression that promised similar justice. "Your laws say innocent until proven guilty," he said, the words carrying a bitter irony. "But you not wait for proof. You kill good man based on lies you make yourself." Sarah realized that this warrior understood more about American law and justice than the men who had murdered her husband. He had learned English, had studied the customs and legal principles of the settlers, while men like Morrison remained willfully ignorant about the people they claimed to be fighting. The war chief walked over to where Thomas's body still hung from the oak tree. With careful, respectful movements, he cut the rope and lowered the body to the ground. His warriors gathered around, and Sarah was amazed to see them remove their own cloaks to cover Thomas's body with dignity. "Your husband died with honor," the war chief told Sarah. "He fight for his woman, die protecting what is his. This is good death, even if came from bad men." Sarah found herself crying again. But these were different tears. For the first time since the horror began, someone was treating Thomas's death as a tragedy rather than a justified execution. Someone was acknowledging that a good man had been murdered by cowards. Morrison apparently decided to make one last attempt to salvage the situation. "Chief, you don't understand. These settlers have been working with raiders, helping them plan attacks on our herds. We had to take action to protect our families." The war chief's laugh was harsh and without humor. "You say settlers work with raiders? Which raiders? My people not take your cattle." "Apache not take your cattle in this area. Mexican bandits maybe, but they not use Comanche weapons." He gestured toward the planted evidence again. "You make these things to blame us for raids that maybe you do yourself. Kill innocent man to hide your own crimes." Sarah saw the truth dawn in Morrison's eyes, saw him realize that his elaborate deception had been unraveled by someone he had assumed was an ignorant savage. The war chief had not only seen through the frame, but had understood the larger pattern of false accusations and manufactured evidence. The other Comanche warriors were growing restless, clearly wanting to finish what they had started. Several held weapons ready, waiting for their chief's word to complete their revenge. But the war chief raised his hand, calling for patience. "You have law," he told Morrison. "You say your people always follow law, not like savage Indians, so we follow your law. We take you to your sheriff, let him decide what justice looks like." Morrison's relief was visible, but the war chief was not finished speaking. "But first, you bury this good man you murdered. You dig grave with your own hands, show respect for life you took. It was a brilliant and humiliating form of justice." Morrison and his surviving men were forced to dig Thomas's grave while surrounded by the very warriors they had been trying to frame. They worked in the growing heat of the day, their fine clothes becoming soaked with sweat as they struggled with unfamiliar tools. Sarah watched from the shade of the cabin, still hardly believing what she was witnessing. The war chief sat beside her, his presence somehow comforting despite everything she had been taught about his people. He asked questions about her life with Thomas, about their plans for the homestead, about her family back east. As they talked, Sarah learned that the war chief's name was Red Eagle, and that he had learned English during a brief period of captivity as a child. He had been taken by soldiers during a raid, but had been treated well by a missionary family before eventually escaping back to his tribe. The experience had given him insights into white culture that most Comanche lacked. "Your husband good man," Red Eagle said as they watched Morrison struggle with his shovel. "He not treat Indian traders bad, not cheat or lie. We know this about him." Sarah stared at him in surprise. "You knew Thomas?" "Not no personal, but no reputation. Indian traders talk, say Thomas Mitchell fair man, pay good prices, not try to trick or steal. This why we know planted things are lies." The revelation added another layer of injustice to Thomas's murder. Not only had he been innocent of cattle theft, but he had actually earned the respect of the very people Morrison was trying to blame. His reputation for fairness had extended far beyond the white community, creating the kind of cross-cultural trust that frontier society desperately needed. As the day wore on and Thomas's grave took shape, Sarah found herself facing an uncertain future. The homestead represented years of work and dreams, but she could not imagine continuing here alone. At the same time, she had nowhere else to go, no family close enough to help, no resources to start over elsewhere. Red Eagle seemed to understand her dilemma without being told. "You not safe here alone," he said quietly. "Men like Morrison, they have friends. They blame you for their shame, maybe come back to finish what they start." The truth of his words was undeniable. Even if Morrison and his men faced justice for Thomas's murder, their supporters would remain. Sarah would forever be marked as the woman whose salvation had come from Comanche warriors, a living reminder of their humiliation and defeat. As the sun began to set, Thomas Mitchell was laid to rest in the Texas soil he had worked so hard to claim. His grave was marked by a simple wooden cross, but it was surrounded by both white and Comanche mourners, an unprecedented gathering that spoke to the complexity of frontier relationships. Morrison and his surviving men were bound with their own ropes, preparing for the long journey to San Antonio and whatever justice awaited them there. But Sarah knew that her own journey was just beginning, and that the Comanche war chief who had saved her life held the key to her uncertain future. The evening air carried a chill as Sarah stood beside Thomas's fresh grave, her hands clasped tightly in front of her black dress. Red Eagle remained nearby, his warriors having made camp a respectful distance from the homestead, while maintaining security around Morrison's captured group. The dancing flames of their campfires created shifting shadows across the prairie, a reminder that her world had fundamentally changed in the span of a single day. Morrison and his surviving men sat bound near the largest fire, their earlier arrogance replaced by sullen acceptance of their fate. They would face trial in San Antonio, though Red Eagle had made it clear that Comanche justice would follow if the white man's courts failed to act appropriately. The war chief's understanding of legal proceedings surprised Sarah, revealing an intelligence that challenged every assumption she had held about his people. As darkness settled over the land, Red Eagle approached Sarah with careful steps. His war paint had been partially washed away, revealing more of his natural features. Without the intimidating designs, he looked younger, more human, though no less formidable. His dark eyes held a combination of strength and compassion that reminded her painfully of Thomas. "You think about what comes next?" he asked, his English more relaxed now that the immediate crisis had passed. Sarah nodded, though she had no clear answers. The homestead felt both like a shrine to her lost husband and a trap that would eventually claim her life. "I don't know where to go. Thomas and we put everything we had into this place." Red Eagle gestured toward the cabin, the barn, the carefully maintained corrals that represented years of backbreaking labor. "Good land, good water. Your husband choose well." But land not safe for woman alone. The reality of her situation was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Even if she could work the ranch alone, which seemed impossible, the social consequences of her rescue would make her a target. Morrison supporters would see her as a traitor, someone who had sided with Indians against white settlers. The fact that she had been saved rather than captured would only fuel suspicions about her loyalty. "There are places back east," Sarah said slowly, thinking aloud more than making plans. "My father has relatives in Missouri, though I haven't spoken to them in years." Red Eagle listened without judgment, but Sarah could see him considering the practical challenges of such a journey. A woman traveling alone across hostile territory, carrying whatever valuables she could transport, would be vulnerable to every form of frontier predator. Highway robbers, unscrupulous traders, and opportunistic men would see her as easy prey. "Long journey," he said finally. "Dangerous for woman alone. Many bad men between here and Missouri." Sarah felt tears threatening again, overwhelmed by the impossibility of her choices. stay and face eventual murder by Morrison's allies, or leave and risk death by robbery or worse during the journey east. Neither option offered much hope for survival, much less for rebuilding a meaningful life. Red Eagle seemed to sense her despair, because his next words came gently. Maybe there is other way. Different choice. Sarah looked at him questioningly, unable to imagine what alternative he might suggest. The war chief was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the prairie where his warriors maintained their vigil. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had clearly cost him considerable thought. My people, we have place for widows. Woman who lose husband in war, in hunt, in sickness, she not left to die alone. Tribe takes care, finds new purpose. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he was proposing. The idea of living among the Comanche was so far outside her experience that she could barely comprehend it as a real possibility. You're saying I should come with your tribe? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Red Eagle nodded slowly. You saved my life once, though you not know it. Winter before last, I track wounded deer, get caught in blizzard. Find your cabin, very sick from cold and hunger. You and your husband, you give food, warm place to sleep, not ask questions. Sarah's memory rushed back to that harsh winter night when Thomas had found a half-frozen Indian at their door. She had wanted to turn him away, frightened by stories of Comanche violence, but Thomas had insisted they could not let a man die in the snow. They had fed him, given him blankets, and sent him on his way the next morning with provisions for his journey. That was you? She breathed, amazed by the connection she had never realized. Your husband not know I am war chief. I dress like hunter, speak little English then. But I remember kindness when I could have died. Now I repay debt. The revelation reframed everything Sarah thought she understood about that winter night. Thomas had unknowingly saved the life of a Comanche war chief, creating a debt of honor that now offered her salvation in her darkest hour. The irony was not lost on her that the very qualities that had led to Thomas's murder, his fairness and compassion toward all people, had also provided her with an escape route. Red Eagle continued speaking, his words carefully chosen. You think my people all savages, yes? This what white men teach. But we have laws, have honor, have ways to protect those who need protection. Sarah found herself considering the possibility seriously for the first time. What did she really know about Comanche culture beyond the fearsome stories spread by settlers? Red Eagle himself challenged every stereotype she had been taught. He was intelligent, honorable, and had shown more genuine justice in one day than the white men who had murdered her husband. What would that mean? She asked. Living with your tribe? Red Eagle explained that Comanche society had specific roles for women in her situation. As a widow under tribal protection, she would not be forced into marriage, but would be given meaningful work and a place in the community structure. She could contribute her knowledge of white customs and language while learning skills that would ensure her survival and value to the tribe. You know many things useful to my people, he said. You read, write, understand white man's ways. You could help when we trade, when we meet to understand settler plans and movements. The practical aspects of the arrangement made sense, but Sarah struggled with the cultural implications. She had been raised to believe that Indians were fundamentally different, that crossing the line between white and native society was both dangerous and morally wrong. Yet the evidence of her own eyes suggested otherwise. Red Eagle seemed to understand her internal conflict. I know this hard choice. You think your people see you as traitor, as women who choose Indian ways over white ways. But what choice you really have? He gestured toward the homestead, toward Thomas's grave, toward the uncertain darkness beyond the firelight. Stay here. Morrison's friends kill you within moon's time. Go back east alone, bandits or weather or worse, kill you before you see Missouri. Come with my people. Live under protection of warriors who honor dead. The brutal clarity of his assessment forced Sarah to confront the reality of her situation without romantic illusions. She was alone in hostile territory with no family nearby, no community support, and no realistic means of reaching safety on her own. The choice was not between comfort and hardship, but between different forms of risk. As the night deepened, Red Eagle shared more details about what life with his tribe would entail. The Comanche were semi-nomadic, following buffalo herds and seasonal resources across a vast territory. Sarah would need to learn to ride well, to help with camp setup and breakdown, to contribute to the constant work of survival on the plains. Hard life, he admitted, but free life, not like white women, trapped in small houses, told they cannot think or act for themselves. Comanche women have power, have voice in tribal decisions. Sarah thought of the restrictions that had governed her life in white society, the constant expectations about proper behavior for women, the assumption that she was incapable of making important decisions without male guidance. Thomas had been more progressive than most, valuing her opinions and treating her as a partner, but even their relationship had operated within accepted social boundaries. The conversation was interrupted by commotion from Morrison's group. One of the captured men was trying to convince his guards that he needed to relieve himself, but his real intention appeared to be escape. Red Eagle moved swiftly to intervene, speaking sharply to his warriors in rapid Comanche before the situation could escalate. Watching him take command, Sarah was struck by the natural authority he wielded. His men obeyed immediately, not from fear but from respect and trust. This was a leader who had earned his position through demonstrated competence and wisdom, not through inherited privilege or political maneuvering. When he returned to their conversation, Red Eagle's expression was more serious. These men, they have friends who will come looking. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. They not accept that Indians defeat white men, save white women. The timeline for her decision was compressing rapidly. Sarah could not remain at the homestead indefinitely while she considered her options. Every day she delayed increased the risk that Morrison's allies would arrive seeking revenge for their humiliation. Red Eagle seemed to sense her growing urgency. You not have to decide tonight. But you think about what I say. Think about what your husband would want for you. The mention of Thomas brought a fresh wave of grief, but also clarity. Thomas had always encouraged her to think for herself, to consider unconventional solutions to difficult problems. He had respected Red Eagle enough to save his life during that winter storm, despite the potential danger. What would he counsel her to do now? As Sarah lay sleepless in her marriage bed that night, surrounded by the familiar possessions that had defined her life with Thomas, she found herself seriously contemplating a future unlike anything she had ever imagined. The widow's quilt her mother had made, the book she had brought from Missouri, the china they had purchased in San Antonio for special occasions, all seemed to belong to someone else's life now. Through her window she could see the glow of the Comanche campfires, could hear the low murmur of voices speaking in a language she did not understand. But she also heard laughter, the kind of easy social interaction that she had been missing during the isolated months at the homestead. Red Eagle had given her until sunrise to make her decision. As the night hours crept by, Sarah found herself weighing not just survival against death, but freedom against convention, possibility against the familiar constraints of her former life. When dawn finally broke over the Texas prairie, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Sarah Mitchell stood at another crossroads. The choice she made would determine not just whether she lived or died, but who she would become in whatever life remained to her. The sound of stirring warriors carried across the camp as Red Eagle's people prepared for another day. Soon they would continue their journey, with or without her. The moment for decision had arrived, and Sarah found that her heart already knew the answer her mind had been struggling to accept. Sarah emerged from her cabin as the first light of dawn touched the prairie grass, carrying a small bundle of possessions that represented the practical remains of her former life. She had packed carefully through the night, selecting items that might prove useful in her new existence, while leaving behind the heavy furniture and delicate belongings that belonged to houses, not to the nomadic life she was about to embrace. Red Eagle stood beside his horse, painting fresh designs on his face with pigments from a small leather pouch. The morning ritual had a ceremonial quality that reminded Sarah she was stepping into a world with customs and meanings she did not yet understand. When he saw her approaching with her bundle, he nodded with satisfaction but without surprise, as if he had known what her decision would be before she made it herself. "You choose well," he said simply, securing his paint pouch and mounting his horse with fluid grace. "Your husband's spirit can rest knowing you find path to safety." The practicalities of her departure were handled with efficient care by Red Eagle's warriors. They provided her with a gentle mare from their small herd, adjusted the stirrups for her shorter legs, and secured her belongings in leather saddlebags designed for constant travel. Sarah had learned to ride as a child, but her skills were rusty after years of settled life, and she felt uncertain about managing a horse during the long journey ahead. Morrison and his surviving men watched the preparations with expressions ranging from bewilderment to outrage. Morrison himself seemed unable to accept that a white woman would voluntarily join the very people he had tried to blame for his crimes. His worldview had no framework for understanding her choice, no way to comprehend that she might find safety and honor among those he considered savage enemies. "You'll regret this, woman," Morrison called out as the Comanche prepared to move. "Mark my words, you'll come crawling back begging for Christian mercy before a month is out." Sarah turned to face him, feeling an unexpected surge of strength and clarity. "My husband showed Christian mercy to a stranger in need," she replied. "It saved my life. Perhaps you should consider what true mercy looks like before you speak of it again." The exchange marked a symbolic turning point for Sarah. She was no longer the helpless victim of Morrison's violence, but a woman making conscious choices about her future. The transformation was subtle but profound, visible in the way she sat straighter in her saddle and met the hostile gazes of the captured men without flinching. The war party began to move as the sun cleared the horizon, heading northwest toward the vast expanse of Comanche territory. Sarah took a final look at the homestead where she had lived and loved and lost everything she thought defined her identity. The cabin looked smaller from horseback, more fragile and temporary than it had seemed when it represented the center of her world. The first hours of travel were challenging for Sarah, as her body readjusted to riding and her mind struggled to process the magnitude of her situation. The Comanche moved with practiced efficiency across terrain that would have challenged experienced frontiersmen, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to her untrained eyes. Red Eagle rode beside her during those initial hours, offering guidance about horse handling and pointing out landmarks that helped her begin to understand Comanche navigation methods. His teaching style was patient but direct, assuming she was intelligent enough to learn quickly, rather than treating her as a helpless burden. "Your people think we wander without purpose," he explained as they crested a low hill that provided views for miles in every direction. "But we know every water source, every good camping place, every route that avoids dangerous ground. This knowledge keeps us alive." Sarah began to appreciate the sophistication of their travel patterns. What looked like random wandering to untrained observers was actually a complex system of seasonal movements designed to maximize resources while minimizing exposure to enemies. The Comanche had survived and thrived on the plains for generations by developing an intimate knowledge of their environment that surpassed anything European settlers had achieved. By midday, Sarah's inexperience was beginning to show. Her legs ached from the unaccustomed position, her hands were cramped from gripping the reins too tightly, and her back protested against the continuous motion of the horse. Red Eagle called a brief halt, officially to rest the horses but clearly intended to give her a chance to recover. During the break, Sarah had her first real conversations with other members of the war party. To her surprise, several of the younger warriors spoke at least some English, learned through trading contacts and occasional interactions with settlers. Their questions about white society were intelligent and practical, focused on understanding customs and motivations rather than passing judgment. One warrior named Swift Horse was particularly curious about white attitudes toward land ownership. "You people say land belongs to one man can never belong to another," he said, his English careful but clear. "But how can Earth belong to any person? Earth was here before all people, will be here after all people gone." The philosophical challenge forced Sarah to examine assumptions she had never questioned. The concept of private property seemed so fundamental to her upbringing that she had never considered alternatives. Yet, as she looked around at the vast prairie, at land that supported buffalo and wolves and countless other creatures without regard for human boundaries, Swift Horse's perspective began to make sense. "We thought we owned our homestead," Sarah said slowly, working through the implications. "But Thomas is dead, and I'm here with you. And the land continues just as it always has." Swift Horse nodded approvingly. "Land use people, people not use land. Smart people learn to live with Earth, not fight against it." The conversation was interrupted by Red Eagle's signal to resume travel. As they mounted their horses and continued northwest, Sarah found herself looking at the landscape differently. Instead of seeing potential farm plots and fence lines, she began to notice the subtle signs that the Comanche used for navigation. The way certain grasses grew near water sources, the flight patterns of birds that indicated game trails, the geological features that provided shelter from storms. The afternoon brought new challenges as they encountered rougher terrain. The horses picked their way carefully down steep ravines and across rocky creek beds that would have been impassable for wheeled vehicles. Sarah's mare proved to be sure-footed and intelligent, responding to the terrain with minimal guidance from her inexperienced rider. Red Eagle used the difficult passages as teaching opportunities, explaining how Comanche horses were trained differently from those used by settlers. "Your people make horse do what rider wants," he said, guiding his mount down a particularly treacherous slope. "We teach horse to think, to choose safe path. Horse has 4 legs, Nose ground better than rider, with 2 legs. The wisdom of this approach became clear as Sarah learned to trust her mare's judgment about footing and balance. Instead of trying to control every step, she began to work with the animal, allowing it to navigate obstacles while she focused on staying centered and balanced. The partnership was more collaborative than the dominant relationship between horse and rider that she had known in white society. Late afternoon brought them to a river crossing that required serious consideration. The water was running high from recent rains, and the current looked strong enough to sweep away horse and rider if they chose the wrong approach. Red Eagle and several senior warriors spent time studying the water, looking for the safest crossing point. Sarah watched with interest as they made their decision through a process that involved multiple opinions and careful consensus building. Unlike white society, where leaders often made unilateral decisions, the Comanche approach seemed more collaborative and thoughtful. Red Eagle clearly held final authority, but he actively sought input from others before committing the group to action. The crossing itself was both terrifying and exhilarating. Sarah's mare entered the water reluctantly, but once committed, she swam strongly toward the opposite bank. The current was indeed powerful, pushing them downstream as they fought to make forward progress. Sarah found herself clinging to the saddle horn, trusting completely in her horse's ability to navigate the dangerous crossing. When they reached the far bank, Sarah felt a surge of accomplishment that surprised her. She had successfully completed a challenge that would have been unthinkable during her sheltered life at the homestead. The experience was a small but significant step in her transformation from protected wife to self-reliant survivor. Evening brought them to a campsite that Red Eagle's group had obviously used many times before. The location provided good grass for the horses, fresh water from a nearby spring, and natural windbreaks formed by rock outcroppings. Within minutes of arrival, the camp was organized with practiced efficiency that spoke to years of nomadic experience. Sarah expected to be treated as a guest or burden, someone who would be cared for while contributing little to the group's welfare. Instead, she found herself assigned specific tasks, gathering firewood, helping with the horses, assisting in food preparation. The work was not optional or symbolic, but genuinely necessary for the group's functioning. The evening meal was a revelation for Sarah. Instead of the simple fare she had expected, the Comanche prepared a complex stew that incorporated dried meat, wild vegetables, and seasonings she could not identify. The cooking process involved techniques and tools that were completely foreign to her, but the results were both nutritious and flavorful. Red Eagle noticed her interest in the cooking methods and arranged for one of the women warriors to begin teaching her basic skills. Many people did not realize that Comanche war parties often included women who served as scouts, fighters, and specialists in various survival skills. The woman assigned to help Sarah was named Bright Star, and her English was excellent due to extended contact with traders. "White women think cooking means standing in kitchen all day," Bright Star said as she showed Sarah how to prepare dried meat for the stew. "Comanche women cook anywhere, with anything, make good food from whatever land provides." The lesson extended far beyond cooking techniques. Bright Star was teaching Sarah how to think about resources and preparation in fundamentally different ways. Instead of depending on stored supplies and familiar ingredients, she was learning to work with whatever materials were available, to see possibilities where she had previously seen only limitations. As darkness fell and the cooking fires provided warmth and light, Sarah found herself participating in social interactions that challenged more of her preconceptions. The Comanche warriors were not grim, silent figures focused only on warfare and violence. They talked, laughed, told stories, and engaged in friendly competition and games. Red Eagle joined a group that was playing a game involving carved bone pieces and complex betting. His participation was enthusiastic and good-natured, revealing a side of his personality that Sarah had not previously seen. When he won a particularly challenging round, his celebration was exuberant but not boastful, showing respect for his opponents even in victory. One of the younger warriors produced a flute carved from wood and began playing melodies that were haunting and beautiful. The music was unlike anything from Sarah's cultural background, but it spoke to emotions and experiences that transcended racial boundaries. Other warriors joined in with drums and rattles, creating a complex musical experience that filled the prairie evening with sound. Sarah found herself drawn into the circle around the musicians, listening with growing appreciation for the sophisticated nature of Comanche arts. These were not primitive people making crude noise, but skilled artists working within a complex musical tradition that she was only beginning to understand. When the formal music ended, several warriors began telling stories. Even though they spoke in Comanche, their expressive gestures and dramatic voices made it possible for Sarah to follow the general outlines of their tales. These seemed to be traditional stories, passed down through generations, that served to preserve history and teach important cultural values. Red Eagle eventually joined her at the edge of the circle, translating portions of the stories that he thought would interest her. Many dealt with the relationship between humans and the natural world, with lessons about respect, balance, and the consequences of greed or arrogance. "Your people have stories too," he observed. "But your stories often about how humans control nature, make it serve human purposes. Our stories about how humans learn to live with nature find their place in great circle of life." The contrast was striking and thought-provoking. Sarah realized that the stories she had grown up with, both religious and secular, did tend to emphasize human dominion over the natural world rather than partnership with it. The Comanche perspective suggested a different relationship with the environment, one based on cooperation rather than conquest. As the evening wound down and people began preparing for sleep, Sarah reflected on how much she had learned in just one day of travel with Red Eagle's group. Her understanding of Comanche culture was expanding rapidly, revealing complexity and sophistication that challenged every stereotype she had been taught. More importantly, she was beginning to see herself differently. Instead of the helpless widow who had stood beside Thomas's grave just 24 hours earlier, she was becoming someone who could ride difficult terrain, contribute to group survival, and participate in a community that valued her contributions. The transformation was far from complete, and she knew that harder challenges lay ahead. But for the first time since Thomas's murder, Sarah Mitchell felt hope stirring within her heart. She was not just surviving, but beginning to discover who she might become in this new life she had chosen. 3 weeks of travel brought them to the main Comanche camp, a sprawling community of teepees stretched across a valley where a clear river provided abundant water, and the surrounding hills offered protection from harsh winds. Sarah's first glimpse of the settlement challenged her expectations once again, revealing an organized society with clear structure and purpose rather than the chaotic band of savages she had been conditioned to imagine. The camp contained nearly 200 people, from elderly grandparents to infants still carried in cradleboards. Children played elaborate games between the teepees while women worked at various tasks and men tended to horses or weapons. The scene was domestic and peaceful, more reminiscent of a small town than a war camp, though Sarah could see the martial readiness that lay beneath the surface calm. News of their arrival spread quickly through the camp, and Sarah found herself the center of curious but respectful attention. Many of the people had never seen a white woman up close, and her presence generated significant interest. However, their behavior was far more polite than what she might have expected from white settlers encountering a Comanche woman in their midst. Red Eagle had clearly sent word ahead about Sarah's situation because a delegation of senior women was waiting to receive her. These were the matriarchs of the tribe, women whose age and experience gave them significant authority in camp decisions. Their leader was an elderly woman named Morning Light, whose weathered face and keen eyes spoke of decades of survival and leadership. "You come to us in time of sorrow," Morning Light said in accented but clear English. "Red Eagle tells us your husband was good man, killed by bad men. This makes you our relative, our responsibility." The formal welcome was both moving and significant. Sarah realized that she was being offered not just temporary shelter, but genuine adoption into the tribal community. The Comanche concept of kinship extended beyond blood relationships to include bonds of obligation and mutual support. Morning Light explained that Sarah would initially stay with her own family group, learning basic skills and customs, while the camp leaders decided on her permanent place within the community.
"You have knowledge useful to our people," she said.
"But first you must learn our ways, show that you can live as we live."
The teepee assigned to Sarah was larger and more comfortable than she had expected. The interior was organized with practical efficiency, with designated areas for sleeping, cooking, and storage.
Buffalo hides provided insulation and decoration, while carefully arranged household items showed the aesthetic sense and craftsmanship of the family that had prepared the space. Sarah's integration into camp life began immediately with a series of lessons designed to teach essential survival skills. Morning Light and her daughters took turns instructing her in tasks that ranged from the practical to the complex. How to properly tend a cooking fire, how to prepare and preserve different types of food, how to maintain and repair clothing and equipment. The learning process was intensive but not overwhelming. Sarah discovered that she had aptitudes she never knew existed, particularly in working with leather and understanding the properties of different plants. Her years of frontier life had given her a foundation in practical skills that translated well to Comanche methods, though the specific techniques were often different. One of her most important lessons involved learning to ride in the Comanche style. The warriors were renowned across the plains for their horsemanship, and Sarah quickly understood why. Their riding techniques were far more advanced than anything she had previously experienced, emphasizing balance, communication with the horse, and the ability to perform complex maneuvers at high speed. Her instructor was a young warrior named Black Wolf, who had the patience and skill necessary to teach someone with Sarah's limited experience. His approach was methodical and encouraging, building her confidence while pushing her to develop new abilities. "White people ride like they're afraid of horse," Black Wolf observed, as he watched Sarah practice mounting and dismounting from both sides of her mare. "Think horse is enemy that must be conquered. We ride like horse is partner, like we part of same creature." The distinction was profound and practical. As Sarah learned to merge her movements with those of her horse, she began to understand why Comanche warriors were so effective in mounted combat. They were not simply men on horses, but integrated fighting units that combined human intelligence with equine strength and speed. Her progress was steady but not without challenges. The physical demands of Comanche life were significant, requiring strength and endurance that she had never needed to develop. Her hands blistered from new types of work, her muscles ached from unfamiliar activities, and her skin darkened from constant exposure to sun and wind. More difficult than the physical adjustments were the cultural and psychological changes required to function effectively in Comanche society. She had to learn new ways of thinking about time, space, relationships, and personal responsibility. The individualistic approach that had served her in white society was less effective in a culture that emphasized collective welfare and group harmony. Language was another major challenge. While many of the Comanche spoke some English, full participation in camp life required at least basic fluency in their language. Sarah spent hours each day with patient teachers, learning vocabulary and grammar that seemed completely unrelated to any European language system. Red Eagle remained her primary advocate and protector during these early weeks, but he was careful not to make her too dependent on his support. "You must find your own place here," he explained during one of their evening conversations. "Cannot always be Red Eagle's white woman. Must become Comanche woman who happens to remember white ways." The distinction was important for Sarah's long-term acceptance in the community. While her outsider status gave her certain protections, it also limited her ability to contribute meaningfully to tribal life. To become truly integrated, she needed to demonstrate that she could think and act as a Comanche while retaining the special knowledge that made her valuable. Her first major test came when a trading party arrived from Mexico, bringing goods to exchange for horses and buffalo products. Sarah's ability to speak Spanish, learned during her years near San Antonio, made her useful as a translator and negotiator. More importantly, her understanding of white trading practices helped the Comanche avoid deceptive schemes that might have cost them valuable resources. The successful conclusion of the trading session marked a turning point in Sarah's acceptance by the community. She had proven that her presence provided practical benefits beyond mere charity, that she could contribute skills that enhanced the tribe's prosperity and security. Morning Light formally acknowledged this change in status during an evening ceremony that drew the entire camp. "She who was Sarah Mitchell of the white people is now walks between worlds of the Comanche," the elderly woman announced. "She carries knowledge of both peoples, can help us understand the changing times ahead." The new name was more than ceremonial recognition. It defined Sarah's unique role within the tribal structure. As walks between worlds, she became a cultural interpreter, someone who could help her adopted people navigate the complex relationships with white settlers, Mexican traders, and government officials. Her responsibilities in this role were significant and sometimes difficult. When military officers arrived under flags of truce to negotiate treaties or discuss territorial boundaries, Sarah found herself translating not just words but concepts and intentions that often had no equivalent in the other culture. These diplomatic encounters were educational for Sarah, revealing the depth of misunderstanding that existed between the two societies. White officials typically approached negotiations with assumptions about property rights, legal authority, and cultural superiority that made genuine communication nearly impossible. Comanche leaders responded with their own cultural framework, emphasizing honor, kinship obligations, and spiritual relationships with the land. Sarah's ability to understand both perspectives made her valuable to all parties, but also placed her in ethically complex situations. She was expected to serve Comanche interests, but her conscience often demanded that she point out the probable consequences of certain decisions or agreements. One particularly difficult situation arose when military representatives offered a treaty that would have confined the tribe to a small reservation in exchange for annual payments of goods and food. The terms seemed generous to some of the younger warriors, who were tired of constant vigilance and frequent conflict. Sarah recognized that the proposed reservation was unsuitable for supporting the tribe's population, and that the promised payments were unlikely to be honored based on the government's track record with other tribes. Her analysis helped the council understand the long-term implications of accepting the treaty, leading to its rejection and continued negotiations. As autumn arrived and the camp prepared for winter, Sarah reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months earlier, she had been a conventional frontier wife with a predictable future mapped out within the boundaries of white society. Now she was an integral member of a Comanche band, with responsibilities and relationships that would have been unimaginable in her previous life. The transformation had not been without costs. She had given up the security of familiar customs, the comfort of shared cultural assumptions, and the possibility of returning to the world where she had been born. But she had gained freedom, purpose, and a community that valued her contributions in ways that white society never had. Most importantly, she had discovered strength and capabilities within herself that might never have emerged under different circumstances. The helpless widow who had stood beside Thomas's grave had evolved into a confident woman who could ride like a warrior, negotiate with hardened traders, and serve as a bridge between conflicting cultures. As winter settled over the plains and the camp prepared for the long, cold months ahead, Walks Between Worlds looked forward to the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. She had found not just survival among the Comanche, but a new identity that honored both her past and her chosen future. The woman who had once been Sarah Mitchell had died beside her husband's grave, but from that loss had emerged someone stronger, wiser, and more complete than she had ever been before. In saving her life, Red Eagle had given her the chance to discover who she truly was, beyond the limitations and expectations that had previously defined her existence. Her story had become proof that survival sometimes required the courage to abandon everything familiar and embrace possibilities that lay beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom. In a land where mercy often came from unexpected sources, Sarah had learned that salvation sometimes wore war paint and spoke in a language her own people called savage. The frontier had tested her and found her worthy of the freedom it offered to those brave enough to seize it. She had become, in the truest sense, a woman of the West, shaped by its challenges and enlarged by its vast possibilities.